The queen was not dying. She was wasting away in her bed day after day while the court doctors invented diagnoses and the servants took turns watching her breathing. She had cancer, that was known to everyone. But what no one dared to say out loud was that her own son, King Charles II, would not sign the permission for her to be given the last rites. Fear, revenge, superstition. Some claimed he hated her as much as he needed her. Others whispered that it was she who did not want to die, that even from her bed she controlled every corner of the Alcazar. Mariana of Austria had been pulling the strings of an empire that no longer responded for decades. She had buried her husband, all her children except one, and her favorite granddaughter, Maria Antonia of Austria. She had reigned in the name of a sickly child, fought against power-hungry bastards, and bet everything on the only great-grandson who seemed able to save the throne, only to see him die before he turned 6. When she finally died in May of 1696, some courtiers approached her coffin with disturbing curiosity. They wanted to check if what was said was true, that her body was so well preserved it looked as if she were sleeping. A divine miracle? Or a grotesque symbol of a dynasty that refused to disappear? But Mariana's story does not begin there, in death. It begins much earlier, in the guts of an empire rotted by inbreeding, incest, ambition, and fear, where girls were handed over to their uncles as wives, where prayers did not heal deformed heirs, where power wore a cassock, and silence was paid in blood. This is not the story of a decorative queen. It is the story of a woman who bet everything to hold together a world that was falling to pieces, and lost every one of her pieces. The girl was born in December amid ice, prayers, and incense. The year was 1634, and Vienna was a place where births were announced with masses and gunpowder, especially if the baby carried imperial blood. Mariana of Austria, daughter of Emperor Ferdinand and of a Spanish woman, had no idea what awaited her. No one did. But from the moment she first breathed, her fate was woven with the cold threads of diplomacy, blood, and consanguinity. She was the youngest of 6 children and the calmest, educated to obey, to speak little, and to pray much. Years later, chroniclers would say she had an angelic face and a pious character. But what she really had was fear. Fear of failing, of saying too much, of not being useful, of being displaced. Because in the courts of the Holy Roman Empire, girls were not daughters. They were chess pieces. From a very young age, she was promised to her cousin, Infante Balthazar Charles, heir to the Spanish throne. She was going to be queen the legal way, without scandal. But fate had other plans. Balthazar died at 16, and with him died Mariana's tranquility. It was then that the Spanish throne's advisors looked around and chose the only viable option, the niece of King Philip IV, who had also been his political fiancé for years. The move was clear. Keep the blood as pure as possible, even if that meant that the 44-year-old king took his 14-year-old niece as his wife. The cards were on the table. Mariana had no choice. They married her, shipped her to Madrid, and locked her in a court that smelled of incense, ambition, and rot. She didn't speak Spanish well, she didn't know her husband, and it didn't take long to discover that the only thing expected of her was to give birth. That's how her reign began, not on a throne, but in a bed, and with her legs open. And she gave birth again and again, as if her only purpose on earth was to fill cribs that would soon become coffins. Between 1651 and 1661, Mariana had 8 pregnancies. Of those, only 2 children lived past infancy: Margarita Teresa, her jewel, her pride, and Charles, the fragile, deformed boy who would be king. The rest vanished like sighs. Some were stillborn. Others lived just weeks or days. One died before being baptized. Each birth was Russian roulette for her body, worn down by pressure, guilt, and endless novenas. Meanwhile, in the Alcazar's halls, tongues wagged about the curse of the Habsburgs, divine punishment for so much incest, so much hidden sin. Doctors couldn't agree. Some blamed the king's semen, others the queen's womb. The outcome was always the same: miniature funerals and a silence that covered everything. But it was with Charles that horror took shape. The boy had a dislocated jaw, bowed legs, a sunken back. He couldn't stand upright. His tongue was too large for his mouth. He didn't speak, didn't reason. At 5 years old, he still wore baby clothes. And yet, he was the heir. The only one. Mariana, devout to the point of obsession, locked herself in the palace chapel to pray for her son. And when that didn't work, she began to control everything around her: doctors, confessors, gowns, diplomats. No one could approach the boy without her approval. Charles became the center of a maternal cult, a living reliquary of guilt and hope. Every time the boy fell ill, and it was often, the palace froze. Rumors flew: "He won't survive the night. He's vomited blood. He's been bewitched." Mariana secretly hired exorcists. She summoned sorcerers from the Pyrenees. But the boy survived, halfway. And meanwhile, she kept losing. The children who weren't born, the respect of the nobles, her faith in herself, but not her control. Mariana learned something very early on. If she couldn't save her children, at least she could rule through her pain. And that made her the most powerful and feared woman in the entire empire. Then the king died. Philip IV closed his eyes in 1665, leaving his widow with a sickly 4-year-old in her arms and an empire in flames. The court filled with vultures. The war with Portugal hadn't ended. France looked northward with hunger. Castile bled in debt, and in the middle of it all, one woman alone faced the weight of the crown. Mariana assumed the regency, but not alone. She was accompanied by a man in a black cassock with a German accent and icy eyes. Father Juan Everardo Nithard, her confessor, her shadow, her shield, and to many her lover. The people hated him. The nobles gossiped. What was a foreign Jesuit doing running Spain's politics? The Inquisition named him Inquisitor General. The Queen made him her right hand, and the Alcazar's halls filled with enemies. The greatest of them, Juan José of Austria, illegitimate son of the late king, brilliant military man, ambitious, charismatic, and hungry for power. Mariana and Nithard exiled him, but he didn't give up. He organized a coup. In 1669, he succeeded. Nithard was expelled from the kingdom, escorted out amid jeers. The queen was publicly humiliated but not defeated. Mariana lost her confessor but kept the regency. And she learned that in Spain, praying wasn't enough. You had to survive, and she still had many pieces left to move. But surviving in the Spanish court wasn't child's play. It was a dance on razor blades, and soon, Mariana lost her footing. The nobility no longer feared her, they hated her. Juan José of Austria, now a popular hero after expelling Nithard, soon forced her political exile. In 1677, Mariana was removed from her son, stripped of power, and sent to Toledo. There, cloistered in a palace convent, she went from all-powerful regent to silenced shadow. Many thought her story ended there, defeated by the machinery of men, armies, and egos. But they didn't know Mariana, because Juan José died 2 years later. And like a queen who never left the chessboard, Mariana returned. In 1679, she returned to court, more cautious, more silent, but more determined than ever. Her son Charles II was already a fragile, submissive teenager, manipulated by everyone, except her. She was still his only figure of authority, the one who signed, who chose doctors, who negotiated with ambassadors, and above all, who decided whom he should marry. She chose Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess who arrived with a double promise, an alliance with France and fertile youth. The House of Orléans offered genetic stability against the diseased lineage of the Habsburgs. Mariana, desperate to ensure continuity, bet on her, believing she would bring new blood to the throne and perhaps an heir. But hope evaporated. Marie-Louise died 10 years later without leaving offspring, another tomb on Mariana's list. Then came the second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, and with her the conflict that would mark the Queen Mother's final years. She was chosen not only for her noble lineage but for an even more important detail. Her family was known for almost miraculous fertility. Mariana was one of no less than 23 siblings. To the Queen Mother, this was a divine sign. If any woman could give Charles an heir, it was her. Young, ambitious, fertile, at least in theory, and very soon a fierce enemy of her mother-in-law. It was then, amid this new palace conflict, that Mariana understood time was not on her side. Charles was aging without heirs. The new queen was becoming increasingly hostile, and foreign powers began aligning their pieces, anticipating an inevitable end. If she wanted to avoid the total collapse of her bloodline, she had to act, and fast. Because in the Spain that was crumbling, survival was no longer enough. There had to be an heir who could change everything. The court split. Mariana of Austria, aged but shrewd, wove alliances with what remained: distrustful ambassadors, loyal ladies-in-waiting, and a few cardinals who still owed her favors. Every move was strategic. She knew Charles would not leave heirs. Her bloodline's story was being written in mourning ink. So she turned her eyes to the only glimmer of hope. Her granddaughter, Maria Antonia of Austria, daughter of her beloved daughter, Margarita Teresa. Maria Antonia had been sent to the court of Bavaria to marry Prince Maximilian Emmanuel. It was not a happy marriage, but it was fertile. They had a son, Joseph Ferdinand. The boy, for the first time in decades, seemed healthy, vigorous, a mix of Austrian and barbarian blood that might just save the Spanish throne. Mariana began a secret, fierce diplomatic campaign. She sent emissaries to Vienna, pressed the Pope, negotiated in the shadows with England and Holland. Her argument was simple. If Charles couldn't father an heir, he had to name one, and not just any foreigner, one who carried some of his blood. Joseph Ferdinand was that name, the chosen one, the child who could make a peaceful transition possible without war. In 1696, Mariana's wish came true. Charles II signed the decree naming Joseph Ferdinand as heir to the crown. The Queen Mother, already sick, nearly blind and bedridden, smiled for the first time in months. Her bloodline had a future. The empire would not fall into French or Austrian hands. It would remain Spanish, or so she believed, because what came next was the cruelest blow of all. In 1699, barely 6 years old, Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria died suddenly in Brussels, officially from smallpox. But the news raised suspicions across Europe. Many believed he had been poisoned by France or the Austrian Empire, both direct rivals in the succession struggle. His body was buried in silence, without glory, without future. Mariana was no longer there to see it, but according to some chroniclers, she left written, "Whoever destroys that child will destroy the balance of the world." And she was not wrong. His death unleashed the storm, the War of the Spanish Succession. The testament of Charles II, the broken dynasty, divided Europe for more than a decade. And so the child who was going to save an empire ended up being the trigger for its fall. Because 2 years after his death, Charles II also died. And with him, the last thread connecting Mariana of Austria to hope. Because Mariana's blood was not destined to endure, and with her last breath, not just a woman died, an empire died. When Mariana's coffin was sealed, no sincere cries were heard in the Alcazar, only sighs of relief. Cancer had consumed her slowly, but the court had been longing for her disappearance for years. Charles II, decayed inside and out, was left alone on the throne. No mother, no heir, no destiny. Those who came to see her corpse weren't there to pay homage. They came to see if the rumor was true, that Mariana's body remained incorrupt, that the woman who had handled kings, wars, and exorcisms looked asleep, as if she refused to accept that she no longer ruled. That image, a dead queen, unaltered by decay, her skin taut like sacred wax, became the symbol of the end of a royal house that refused to accept its end. The Habsburg dynasty did not explode in war. It crumbled from within, from impure blood, from the obsession to control the uncontrollable, from mothers raising crowned corpses. Mariana was both victim and executioner. She saved her son and ruined him. She ruled with resolve, but from fear. She bet everything on a doomed family and died knowing her bloodline was a dead-end alley. Her intact corpse was not a miracle. It was an eternal punishment. To remain whole while everything else rotted. This was not the story of a decorative queen. It was the story of a woman who faced fate with her nails, who fought to preserve a world that no longer existed, who ruled with a crucifix in her hand and the shadow of death in her eyes. Mariana did not leave a legacy. She left a warning. Mariana of Austria was not the queen they mourned. She was the queen who survived them all and died alone. Her power became a cage, her faith silence. She raised a king who could not reign, buried all her heirs, bet her legacy on the future, only to watch it unravel between her fingers. When her coffin was closed, what remained was not grief, but relief. Because Mariana was not a mother to the court, nor a savior to the people. She was the echo of a broken dynasty. The end of the Habsburgs was not an explosion, it was a whisper. A woman, a child, and a crown without a head. That's how empires die, not with screams, but with oblivion. If this story shook you as much as it did us while telling it, don't forget to support this channel with your subscription, a like, and by sharing it with those who love unfiltered history. Did you know this side of Mariana of Austria? Do you think she was a victim or the architect of her own disaster? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, where power, tragedy, and intrigue intertwine, turn on the bell so you don't miss the next chapter of Tales from Time.